West Side.
The world is mine, nigga, get back. Don't fuck with my stack. The gauge is whacked. About to drop the bomb, I'm the motherfucking dime.
Both teams get a grip on this operation, Heather. That's bored. Relight the asset.
Sir, I need more time.
We have no time. Are you going to give that order or not?
Sir, please.
You're too naive to see the truth. There's no bringing in Bourne.
We will defend these police officers.
Listen to police officers' commands, listen to what we tell you, and just stop. The nation needs to realize that when we tell you to do something, do it. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, then the courts will figure it out.
We don't get to pick the law, we enforce it. But at the end of the day, each and every member should go home safe. Sometimes the use of force is necessary. You need to comply with the police officer the way the system was meant to be. Comply with the orders of police officers. Resisting arrest is a real and dangerous crime.
Nonpartisan Liberty for All. I'm your host, Dave Bourne, and it is October 11th, 2016, and we're coming to you live from Las Vegas, Nevada. Thank you for tuning in to Nonpartisan Liberty for All. We're on weeknights, Tuesday through Thursday at 7 o'clock Pacific, 10 o'clock Eastern on the Nonpartisan Liberty for All network, which now runs, actually, it's the Nonpartisan Liberty for All radio and media and radio network. I'm forgetting the name of my own network. Actually, I wrote it down wrong. So I'm going to fix that. Media and Radio Network, which now runs 24/7. And you can listen live on Spreaker.com and NonpartisanLibertyForAll.com. And to the archives immediately following the show on Spreaker, YouTube, Twitter, Tumblr, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and iTunes. On Nonpartisan Liberty for All, we promote self-ownership and the ideas of true freedom and liberty, meaning being able to do whatever you want as long as you respect the freedom of others and don't interfere with their freedom. Exposing government for what it is, a mafia based on extortion that rules without consent by threat of force and violence. And they also rule with something they don't have authority. They have no authority. And I might add this to my intro or redo my intro, but the thing that people forget about is that the government's authority is a bunch of men with guns. And that's it. You know, you may, somebody brought out a point, I think it was Ken Shorgen, who will be joining us tomorrow night. He joins us every other Wednesday to talk about geopolitics and the economy. But was that, well, some people essentially are ruled by money, or it wasn't ruled, it was more they comply. So they comply because they get a monthly check, or they comply because they feel an obligation or whatever. And that may be the case. However, at the same time, it's enforced by threat of force and violence. If you decide not to comply because of that, then the result is going to be violence. So even though a bunch of people may comply because they're brainwashed to, or because they get a check or food stamps from the government and they've been bought off, essentially, it doesn't mean that it's still not based on threat of force. Because bottom line is it is. It doesn't mean that every single person is complying because of threat of force. If they're not, I would say they're ignorant. And ignorance doesn't mean you're stupid. And I've explained this before. So if I use the word ignorant, it's look up the definition of ignorant. It's almost like it's similar to naive. It's, you know, you just don't know the truth. You don't know what really goes on. So I would consider those people ignorant, not stupid. I mean, I said this before. You have obviously all of these scholars and supposedly geniuses that believe in the whole concept of government and what they're doing, and would somehow defend it. I don't know. You know, I know all the bullshit defenses that people use because they all say the same thing. You know, it's, well, you have to help support the community and you have to pay taxes to help support that, and all this bullshit that each point can be refuted down to the detail. I mean, there are some points that you could say, well, what would you do about this and what would you do about that? And does everyone have the specific answer? I mean, there's a lot of answers and there's a lot of options and there's a lot of different ways to do things. Just like when they wrote the Constitution, everything wasn't mapped out. And now they come up with, they still come up with situations where they don't know how to handle it, and then they make a stupid fucking law for it. So anyway, tonight we're going to be talking all about the UN and their agenda, their revised agenda that's supposed to run until 2030. The specific name of it I do have somewhere. I actually have this document you can download, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Global Action, which is the final draft of the outcome document for the UN Summit to adopt the post-2015 development agenda. And I had went over this before, maybe a couple years ago when I had started the show, or maybe a year into the show or something like that, where I actually went through and read most of the document. It's not that long, but it's long enough. I mean, it's 30 something pages, and when you're reading something like that, it's just monotonous, and it's, you know, going through all this shit, and at the same time you're trying to really figure out the meaning behind what they're trying to say. And I mention this a lot, but I don't really go into details. I mentioned how they want to have all the rich countries, and it actually spelled it out in the draft that I read. I don't know if they've taken it out of this one. I went through it, but I didn't read the whole thing. But they were planning on the richer countries giving to the poorer countries. So it's based on things. It's kind of based on what the government agenda is now, to be honest. It's based on things like redistribution of wealth, making everybody equal. It's something you would see in one of those fucking scary movies in the future that are not supposed to be scary in the terms of a horror movie, but are scary because they're about just making people equal, like Harrison Bergeron. I don't know if people have read that short story. I think it was Kurt Vonnegut who had wrote that, where they actually put on, and I've talked about this before, but they put on these bans on people. They actually, bans on their head, meaning they actually made I think it was like a TV movie, or I don't know if it wasn't an after school special, but I think it was a TV movie that might have aired on like HBO or something. And it had Sean Austin in it. It probably came out, I'm thinking late 90s. I remember reading this story in school, but the movie was a lot more hard hitting, in my opinion, and really they should have made an actual feature film off of this and added to it, you know, made a film based off the short story that changed a lot of the things, because I think the movie was only an hour. I don't know if it was actually a movie per se, and I could be wrong. It could be a full length. But I mean, you could make like a 2.5 hour blockbuster movie about this. Of course, they wouldn't make a blockbuster about it because it's exactly what they want to do. I don't know that they want to do it in the same way. But what they did was they took these things that they would put on their heads that they had invented that would make people stupider. So it would suppress your intelligence. And Sean Austin was just so smart that it just broke, basically. It couldn't contain his brain. That rhymes. I'm going to put that in a rap song. Because he was so smart, they took him to the underground people that were really running the whole country. So the president was elected via lottery, literal like playing the lottery. And I don't think you got to play. I think they just like selected, you're the president. And because it didn't matter. People don't really mention this that much, and I'm really surprised. I don't think I've ever heard anybody mention Harrison Bergeron, and it's been, like I said, the story, which was, from what I remember when I read it, I'm going to look it up right now, it was short, and the movie, didn't get a lot of exposure, but it was on, either HBO or Showtime. And I never really heard anybody mention this because you would think even supposed, conservatives would mention this because it's a metaphor for communism to an extent and socialism, making everybody equal. But at the same time, it's a metaphor for an oligarchy. It's pretty much what they're trying to do now, in a sense. So I'm surprised I never heard anybody mention it. I may have once or twice, but not as much as, 1984 is mentioned all the time. And I don't know, to me, I didn't read the book, but I did see the movie. I have it on DVD. And maybe because it was over hyped to me, I don't know. I just expected more. So it was a they call it a satirical and dystopian science fiction short story by Kurt Vonnegut. This is according to Wikipedia. Originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and the story was republished in the author's Welcome to the Monkey House collection in 1968. And I don't remember what grade I had read this in, but I guess it takes place in 2081. Amendments to the Constitution dictate that all Americans are fully equal and not allowed to be smarter, better looking, or more physically able than anyone else. And the handicap or general agents enforce the equality laws, forcing citizens to wear handicaps. I forgot about this. Yeah, masks for people who are too beautiful, radios inside the ears of intelligent people, and heavy weights for the strong or athletic. So Harrison Bergeron was intelligent, and he would have to wear the bands. But I think in the movie, they had actually everybody had to wear the bands no matter what, if you were smart or not, like everybody in his class. I remember the main parts of the movie because I only seen it once, and it came out in 95 on Showtime, made a full-length made-for-TV adaptation with Sean Austin, as I had said. And those were the things that I had remembered. And of course, the biggest part I remembered was the ending the biggest part, the most memorable and main part that I had remembered was in the end, at least in the movie, I can't remember the story too well because it had to be either junior high or elementary school when we read the story. It was in like a book of stories. I guess back then they would allow something. I would seriously doubt you'd see this in any book now, but in either elementary school or junior high, they had a book of stories and this was in it. And it goes way beyond what I've said. My memory, because it's been so long and when I read it, it was a long time ago and I only read it once and I only saw the movie once. But he gets on TV and blows his brains out to show everybody. Like I think he tells everyone what's going on. You essentially have this underground oligarchy that runs the government. You have a president who is, at least this is in the movie, the president who is elected by lottery, who actually is funny, is played by the father from American Pie. He's been in so many fucking movies. I can't think of his name right now. Eugene Levy plays the president. And it's funny. I guess it was quoted by attorneys in a brief before the Kansas Supreme Court. So I've heard that Kurt Vonnegut was lean towards anarchism, actually. Maybe not, or no government, but he had been someone who supported freedom. Now, I don't know enough about him to know that. I know he was in Back to School. If you see the movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield, so he goes back to school. For people who haven't seen it, rent it or get it on DVR or whatever. Order it from Amazon. It's probably cheap. It came out in '86. But it's a funny-ass fucking movie. And Rodney Dangerfield is a rich millionaire who has this big business, and I don't even think he graduated from high school. And his son is going to college. But his son's like, I'm going to drop out, look at you and how successful you are. And he's like, well, I told you, without an education, you're nothing. Which I think has proven to be bullshit. Or maybe education is not the word. He said education, but you don't have to get an education from a university or from a government school. But I think education is important. It's just not schooling that's important. But he had said, I'll do it with you. So Rodney Dangerfield at like 60 something goes back to school. He doesn't have his high school transcripts or diploma. And it's funny because the fucking dean, and people that have seen it are probably laughing right now. People that haven't are probably like, what the fuck is this motherfucker talking about? But so the dean was Dean Martin, and everybody knows who Dean Martin is. Just, even people that weren't alive, I wasn't alive when Dean Martin was famous, but I know who Dean Martin is, a member of the Brat Pack or the Rat Pack. I'm thinking of the Brat Pack later in the 80s. But his last name was Martin, and they have the dean of the college, so they called him Dean Martin. And he's like, how can I let somebody with it was the guy who got raped in Deliverance, actually, Ned Beatty. He's like, how can I let somebody with no real transcripts or no high school diploma into a prestigious school such as whatever the fuck the name of the school was. I think it was a made-up school. And he's like, and he said, we're known for we're handpicked. We handpick our students from the creme de la creme. And he's like, that's what I like about this school, Dean Martin. And so he donates money. And I'm going to totally forget my point. But now I remembered. So what Rodney Dangerfield does is in his English class, they have to do a paper on Kurt Vonnegut, right? So I didn't know Kurt Vonnegut was a lot like that young. I mean, I thought he was older for some reason. But I know he's dead now, but he was still alive in 1986. And I think he even died not that long ago. I'll have to look that up real quick. But yeah, Kurt Vonnegut was born in He died in 2007. Yeah. So he died 9 years ago, April 11th, 2007 at 84. So yeah, he wasn't that old. Meaning, he wasn't from like the generation before that. But I, like he didn't live in the 1800s. I had, seen that movie so many times, and so he has to write a paper about Kurt Vonnegut, and he hires Kurt Vonnegut to write it. Not only does he hire him to write it, but the teacher, who's played by Sally Kellerman, who he's trying to date, he's like, I know you didn't write this paper and whatever, and whoever did doesn't know a thing about Kurt Vonnegut. It's funny because Kurt Vonnegut wrote the fucking paper. I'm sorry, that was a long story to get to a, semi good punchline, but it's definitely a good movie. You should see it. But anyway, so I had heard that he was, he leaned towards that. Now I could be totally off because I think I had heard that from Anarchist, and this might have been later in his life. That he had these thoughts, and it might have just been, something like that. We will look into it and say, okay, well, this must mean this, and that he must have this view. And it could have just been, hey, what if this happened and it would be interesting? And usually that's not the case. But I remember in film school where in film theory and criticism, it was everything meant something. And I used to think, well, what if, and I still think this, what if this really didn't mean shit? It just fit nicely. Like, I didn't think every little detail stood for something. The professor would go through, well, this and like Jaws or something. I remember we watched like some scenes from that, and this means this, and this is a metaphor for this, and whatever. And it's like, okay, I buy into some of that, actually a lot of it, but as somebody who had to write a script for school for a full length feature film, and I thought about that. Because they teach you that, and then you start thinking about, well, maybe I can make this mean this, and I can have this, but I didn't go to that extent where every little fucking detail meant something. So even in that, it could have been a story that he just came up with, because I guess he did a lot of satire. Again, I don't know enough about him to really know, but I did hear that, so I'll have to look into that. If this is just a note from Wikipedia. It says that he theorized that the story was a satire on American Cold War misunderstandings of communism and socialism. See, I didn't take it that way at all. I honestly took it because it's almost a reality now. So it was, I mean, parts of it were joke-like. Even in the movie, especially in the book or in the story, they had some pictures of like how like the good looking people were, made to look fucked up and whatever, and, with masks and made to look stupid and things like that. And it was kind of weird in that sense. But later on, when I always looked at it, I looked at these couple things. And in a genre that it says that he's known for is political fiction. So I'll have to do some more research about him and see, and maybe I'll even do a show. It would be an interesting show about writers or, even filmmakers that are, don't believe in government or made movies or writings about these types of things. But the way I took it was literally making everybody equal and having, but the part that to me really wasn't a joke is also that you had that oligarchy really, and at the time I didn't, even when I saw the movie when I was like 18 or 19 or something, I didn't know the definition of an oligarchy. I knew, I guess, what a group of people running the government would be, or that I had probably thoughts of, people with money get away with a lot of shit and get away with more than people that don't have money, because we didn't have money. I mean, we weren't poor like in poverty. I didn't grow up in poverty, but didn't have money. I mean, lived in an apartment until, I didn't have my own room till I was 21, but it's not like I was in a room with like 5 people neither. I mean, just my brother. But I lived with my parents till I was 24, and I'm almost giving away my age. But the last like 3 years I lived with them, I finally had my own room, which was like, oh my God, I felt like I grew up in jail. And that's more about my father. But so we grew up like, I wouldn't even say we were middle class, because we didn't have a house. We always had food. We had clothes. We didn't have to share pants. Like I hear about people that live in poverty. We weren't close to poverty. Okay. So I don't want to exaggerate when I say we didn't have money. We didn't go on vacations. I didn't go on a plane till I paid for that, or actually they might have helped me pay for it, but to fly back from Vegas when I had moved out here the first time. But we didn't go on any vacations. Like we go on a day vacation. So like, the rich people, they have cabins and shit, or they have, a summer home or some shit like that, or a condo somewhere. We would just go to like New Hampshire or usually New Hampshire, because they had all the parks, like the places you go to that during the summer, they're open, they're amusement parks. So we go there for the day. That would be our like vacation type shit that we do. So, I mean, we had enough money to do that. We go to the movies. I mean, it's not like I grew up, in fucking, we grew up in a 2-room apartment with, and all slept in the same room. And we did have one apartment with 1 bathroom and 4 people. That wasn't too cool. But I mean, again, there's people with 10 people in a 1-room apartment. So that's not poverty, having an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 bathroom and, 4 people. But that's not, as far as being part of any type of class that got any respect or anything. I mean, my father drove a cab or was a dispatcher his whole life. He grew up basically in some bad areas. I mean, he was just a street kid. He moved to the suburb of Boston when his senior year of high school, which was still like 10 minutes from Boston. But I mean, it wasn't a bad, especially back then, it wasn't bad at all from what I guess people did fight. When I lived there, it wasn't bad. Like no one got shot or stabbed, but you had to worry about getting jumped in fights and shit like that. And that's the extent of it. But a lot of people don't grow up like that. And maybe a lot of people do grow up like that. I don't know. But, this was years ago. So anyway, to get back to the UN, my point was with Harrison Bergeron is that the UN document it's a farce. It's a front for socialism and communism. And of course, it makes it sound so nice. They had celebrities do a commercial for it. And this is how it came back under my radar, is because YouTube, and this is what makes it even worse. So YouTube recommended this video, and they didn't recommend it to me when I was logged in, because I delete all my shit and whatever. So they recommended it as, if you go to YouTube and they don't have a history on you, they'll just put what they'll call popular videos. But this was on there. And I guess it was made in December of 2015, which wasn't that long ago. And I'll play it. I have the audio. And you can also look it up on YouTube. But that's how I started thinking about this again. And then, of course, the other thing that we'll touch on later, which has come up a bunch of times. But the fact that it's coming up again now with what's going on, and it's the agenda of certain people makes it more suspect. But they have the UN started talking about reparations for Black people. I love it how the UN, though, talks about the U.S. and something like that. And I'm not saying that whether it's out of line or not, and I'll get into that. I will say that if we were talking about this in 1870 or 1880 or 1890 or even 1900, there'd be no question. Definitely, not only reparations, but I would seize the property of the slave owners, which was huge, I believe, in a lot of cases. And I would take that shit up and divide it to all the slaves, and give them a piece of land so they had a place to build a fucking house. So I would have done that at the same time. I would have seized all of their property. Like, you want to talk about asset forfeiture now. Now, as somebody who doesn't believe in government, I'm basing it upon the times, because government also enforced slavery, made laws against runaway slaves and bringing them back and all of that shit too. But at the same time, people were responsible as well by keeping slaves, because if nobody kept slaves, you can't have slaves if nobody will buy them. So, but if the government made it illegal way before that, I think the majority of people would not have slaves if it was illegal, and maybe none of them would have had slaves. So ultimately, the government, and reparations should have came from the government. But I think that all of these people, and I know it's hard to look at a law and say, well, it was legal here and now it's not, and we're going to punish you. But I would put that in the same category as Hitler, that he made, laws that made it legal for everything. The commands they followed were legal commands at the time. But then when the U.S. overtook, or not just the U.S., but the Allied forces overtook Germany, all of those things that were done were deemed war crimes. So I would look at it the same way and seize all the property of all of these slave owners. Really what I would have liked to see back then, and there were a couple of them, and this Birth of a Nation, I think, is based on one of them. And I remember them very well. There were 3 slave rebellions. I can't remember one of the names, but Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, which I believe this movie is on, that Birth of a Nation, which of course the original was like a Klan movie, and we talked about it in film school, and I don't know if I blocked it out or just don't remember. I remember that it came up because it was like one of the first movies to be made or something, or to be aired in a theater or some shit. There was something about it that was the first. I don't remember. And, film school was a long time ago. But I didn't have a problem with what they did. And there was another rebellion. I can't remember the other man's name. And then, of course, there was John Brown. And John Brown, the thing that bothered me about John Brown is that I felt that he did it over religion. So he thought slavery was the devil's work and all of this stuff. And, I agree as far as how bad it was. And it really had an effect on me when I was in junior high. That's why when I talk about all of these things like Black Lives Matter being a communist front and their agenda being the agenda of progressives and stuff like that, it's just being honest about what's going on and telling people, because I believe in freedom for everybody, and I'm going to call out whatever race, if there's a movement that has to do, not that I'm calling out all black people, but if it's a movement that is mostly black, I'm not going to not say anything because, I've said this before, people will think I'm racist or that's racist to say that, because they don't know me and they don't know what I've been through. And I've talked about a lot of it on the show, and some people have heard those shows and some people haven't. But it really affected me in junior high. And I went to junior high, and there was always indoctrination in schools, but I didn't, at the time I was in junior high, I didn't look at it, and I don't look back on it as indoctrination at all, because that's not the way they presented it. And they didn't defend any of these people. I remember my teacher called, Nat Turner and the Gabriel Prosser and all them like murderers, and he demonized them, which I didn't, not even at the time. I said, hey, if you're going to fucking own people and treat them like that, and then they go around and fucking kill you, because that's what Nat Turner did, is he went door to door and killed people. Killed white people. Well, I mean, all the white people were slave owners. I don't know if he ended up killing any non-slave owner, like poor people that were white, but he went to the plant. I mean, I think he was killing slave owners, but they say he killed white people. But all the white people, all these slave owners were white, so whatever. So he... obviously, I think he killed 41 people or something. I don't know why that number sticks in my head, because this is remembering 8th grade. But John Brown was a white guy, and he went to, he was the abolitionist, and I admired him. But what bothered me again is I felt like he was only doing it because he was religious. So like, he felt, he interpreted religion the way it should have been interpreted, that all people are free. And how can you say you're, Christian and own people, which makes no fucking sense. I mean, that's why religion is so fucked up, because how do you justify the past? And you could say, well, it's changed and it's religion. And how can religion change? They keep updating religion like, oh, well, God just changed his mind on those things. Is that what happened? He felt this way and now he feels this way. Oh, and I also forgot to mention, we'd love to hear from you. So you can reach us via, I got to turn my Skype on. You can reach us via Skype at Nonpartisan Liberty for All is the username, or you can reach us at 702-470-7664. That's 702-470-7664. So, if you want to, I got a message about, I don't know what it means actually, but that was, now we're 24/7. So people might think that a show is live, and they texted, and I don't know what that message meant. Anyway, so when we are the phone, technically I don't carry it on me when I'm not on air, but you can always leave a message if you want. And if you want me to address a question on air or want me to reply or something like that, that's fine. You can text me at 702-470-7664. That's the official show line, but I don't carry it around all the time. I have a daytime job, obviously, and I don't make any money off this at the point being. So I do have a show line, but I don't keep it around with me. I use it specifically for to call into the show. So again, you can either call in or Skype in. The username is Nonpartisan Liberty for All, and of course, you can go to nonpartisanlibertyforall.com and get all that information if you forget the phone number or how to contact us or the email address, as well as archives, articles, a whole bunch of blogs and articles on there about legalizing drugs and other stuff. I'm trying to do that more often. I wish I had more time, and I wish I did it a lot more than I do, so I apologize for that. But with my full-time job and, of course, the radio show, and I want to start doing short YouTube videos, which will probably end up being the easiest part. Not to say that people that do YouTube videos, it's easy. I know you have to edit and all that stuff, but I'm talking about doing 10-minute videos. Not the easiest, but it will be shorter. Because if I do a 2 to 3 hour show, that's a long time that takes up. Now, if I do a 10-minute video, and it all depends on how many takes, and I know from, like I said, I went to film school. I used to film everything with my video camera when I was a kid. So I guess it would depend on how many takes. But if I could get it done in, 1 or 2 takes and do videos that are more, where I'm not doing a bunch of camera angles and not being all sophisticated and all that shit, I could probably get those done pretty quick, but we'll see. So those are the main things I'm going to talk about with the UN. We'll also talk about some of the history and Agenda 21, which really, this new document is really just an updated version, in my opinion, of Agenda 21. So it really, I think, and I haven't thought about this in a little while, but it's like things are going where Harrison Bergeron went. Now, not in the satirical sense where they're going to make people equal, although I think something that they could do, and they did this in a movie. I mentioned it a couple weeks ago when I had seen it. It's with the girl from that the kids' vampire movies, where they glow when it's dark out or whatever. That's why they lived in Seattle where it rained all the time. Twilight. The girl from Twilight's in it, and some other guy. I have no idea who he is. But they're born, because of the altered genetics, they're born without emotions. So they're all like equal. It's to make, I think that's the name of the movie. I think it was called Equals. And it's to make everybody equal in that, to an extent that nobody's emotional, nobody can touch each other. And when they have babies, that they somehow remove the emotions. So this isn't something that I see happening anytime soon. However, with technology and how technology just goes so fast, I mean, they're already able to find, birth defects and stuff like that before the baby's born. So, maybe this is something 50 years out. And so, I mean, not that long. that they were or maybe more than that, because you think about being able to remove emotions. But what happens is, I guess it doesn't take on some people, basically, and later in their life they start to develop emotions, and this couple falls in love, basically, and then they invent a cure. They call it a cure for it, and I guess you got to see the movie because I don't want to ruin it, but it's that kind of same thing where it's not just about making people financially equal. It's about total equality, not opportunity, but they want everybody to be equal. So if you start, and let me open this document on my other computer. If you look at this document and you start to read into some of this stuff, it's like, and it reminds me of this other movie with, and I can't think of his name right now, neither. My mind always goes blank. It's called Equilibrium, actually. They drug the people so they're not emotional. And they've been convinced that in order to keep peace, they have to be unemotional, because emotions, of course, cause war and cause people to hate and stuff like that. So in order to eliminate wars and have peace and all of this stuff, that they take medicine to eliminate their emotions. And it has a really famous actor in it who's everybody knows. I don't know why I can't think of his fucking name. Jesus, he played the guy who played Batman, Christian Bale. So Christian Bale was in it. It's called Equilibrium. And who's the other guy? He was in like the movie The Best Man. He's black. I can't think of his name. He's in it too. People would know. You'd know him if you've seen him though. But it kind of goes through, we want peace. We want prosperity for everybody. So they have 17 different planks, basically. First, they go through all of this shit, but they want total equality for women, equality for all countries. And of course, it's their sustainable development goals. So I'll go through these goals. They're one sentence here, and then of course they go into more detail, but I'll go into these and then we'll take a quick break and play the clip on that the celebrities did for this document. Essentially, it's end poverty in all its forms everywhere, end hunger, active food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. When you hear sustainable, that's always bad. Just so you know, it's like a code word for this is bad, because it means that it has to be sustained. So in order to sustain it, there's things we're going to have to do, like ration and only use so much and all of shit like that. That's why. And they assume that without doing those things that we're going to run out of them. And there's no way with all the technology in agriculture, even with weather, climate change. Of course, they mention climate change. That's a huge thing for them because it's an easy way to get international laws and world government and tax everybody. But and get them into one of the things that was mentioned in Agenda 21, sort of, in a roundabout way. But it's pushed that climate change, like they won't be able to do, we don't do anything now, it's the scare tactic. But with all the technology, even with that, it's not something I would even worry about, even if it's true that, and when I say true that climate change is man-made. If they say that the climate is changing, I guess it is. I don't know. But that it is man-made. Even though world temperatures have gone down and there's evidence, there's people on both sides, whatever. But environmentalists to me are pretty fucked up people. And I feel bad saying that, but I understand wanting to keep clean water and having forests and trees. Of course, we need them for the oxygen anyway. And we breathe out carbon dioxide. It's like, I'm talking about the environmentalists that look at the world as more important than the life of people. So meaning that, if getting rid of this forest would somehow save thousands or millions of lives, it's better to keep the forest. And I think that's really fucked up. So I'm not too fond of environmentalists in general, but I don't want to stereotype them. I'm sure there are environmentalists that aren't, I guess, fanatical environmentalists bother me. People that just want clean air. I mean, I want clean air. I want clean water. I don't want polluted streams. I mean, I don't want any of that shit. Does anybody? Nobody wants that. But to say, well, because of this, and this is the real thing that gets me on climate change, is, well, because of this, we're going to have to tax you a ridiculous money for your electricity. So that leads to the Agenda 21 thing of having everybody in stackable housing, like, what do they call it? Like projects, except worse, because they would be tiny little 400 square foot stacked up housing, and it'd be in little areas. So it would be a lot easier for the government to control and to monitor and all of that stuff. And then you wouldn't need a car because, of course, your jobs would be right there, and your jobs would be pretty much picked for you in a sense that from a very young age, from all the data they collect, they're going to be able to predict what you're going to be best at and push you in that direction and essentially force you unconsciously or subconsciously to, that would be unconsciously, I think, to go and end up doing this job. So, and that's maybe getting a little ahead of myself, but let me just get through these. So, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And remember, this is for the whole world. Ensure inclusivity and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And while I believe there's gender equality in the United States for the most part, there's different benefits that different sexes get. If you really want to look at it, girls get, especially pretty girls, get benefits that guys don't get. There's benefits that guys may get that girls don't. However, I think girls get more benefits than guys do in general. And all I see in positions of power at my job are women that are directors and above. That's it. At least in relation to the amount of men. And I'm not going to go into where I work or anything like that. But so ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Of course, sustainable. Promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable. I mean, I've said sustainable about 5 times already. Economic growth. Full and productive employment and decent work for all. Build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization and foster innovation. Yeah, that's going to be hard to do with a lot of the other things you want to do. Reduce inequality within and among countries. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And if while you're listening to this, most of this is impossible if you're looking at it on a scale of do this for everybody. And this is government. Make sure you do this for everybody. Remember that while I'm going through this. And yeah, they sound nice. Everybody have this and everybody have that and everybody have this. But, you know, in reality, they don't just magically appear from nowhere. Reduce inequality with and among countries. Make citizens and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. That's where you come in with the little apartments, because you can't sustain big houses or living in the country where, not country, but rural areas where you have to drive an hour to work or something like that. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Conserve and sustainably. Damn, they're using it like, is that an adverb there? I was never good with my grammar. Use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. So you got it twice in one sentence. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainable managed forests, combat desertification, and halt and reserve land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. I don't know what the fuck that means. Promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. Provide access to justice for all. And build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Well, of course, we want justice for all, and we want accountable institutions. But that doesn't mean it's going to magically fucking happen. Strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. So those are the 17 goals of their sustainable development goals. So we'll play this commercial and a few other clips, and when we get back, we'll get into the document. We'll get into the original version of this, I would say, or at least it comes from this, which we've done a show on before, Agenda 21. I mean, it's adding to it, if anything, or revising it, or whatever you would like to call it, because I think Agenda 21 is from 1992. And we'll talk about the UN and their recommendation of reparations. And I don't even know that they're sure what they mean by reparations, because it wasn't very clear from what I understand. So we'll try to talk a little about that depending upon how much time we have. So we will be right back. Nonpartisan Liberty for All. Don't forget on Mondays that the Illumination Hour airs 7 o'clock Pacific, 10 o'clock Eastern. And if you missed last night's episode, you can go to any of the various mentioned I was going to say applications, but websites, Spreaker or YouTube, and there's others. And you can get all the specific addresses at nonpartisanlibertyforall.com to listen to last night's episode of the Illumination Hour. And we will be right back after this. nonpartisanlibertyforall.com.
Are you looking for a podcast that talks about life, the universe, and everything? Listen in to the Illumination Hour, Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. Listen live at Spreaker.com or nonpartisanlibertyforall.com. We're also on SoundCloud, Spreaker, Twitter, Tumblr, YouTube, and iTunes. The Illumination Hour. Brought to you by Nonpartisan Liberty for All Media and Radio Network. And your host, Ellen Stallone. Because a spark can illuminate the world.
We can be.
We must be the first generation
to end extreme poverty.
The generation
most determined
to fight injustice and inequalities.
The generation that saves the planet from climate change.
And this is how it will get done.
The global goals.
A 15-year plan
for everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
We will live in a world
where nobody
anywhere lives in extreme poverty.
Where no one
goes hungry.
Where no one
wakes in the morning
asking if there will be food today.
We will live in a world where no child has to die
from diseases we know how to cure.
And where proper health care
is a lifelong right for us all.
We will live in a world
where everyone
goes to school. And education gives us the knowledge
and skills
for a fulfilling life.
We will live in a world where all girls and all women have equal opportunities
to thrive
and be powerful
and safe.
We cannot succeed if half the world is held back.
We will live in a world
where all people can get clean water
and proper toilets at home,
at school,
and at work.
We will live in a world where there is sustainable energy for everyone.
Heat, light,
and power for the whole planet.
Without destroying the planet.
We will live in a world where economies prosper and new wealth
leads to decent jobs
for everyone.
And we will live in a world where our industry,
our infrastructure, and our
best innovations
are not just used to make money, but to make all our lives better.
We will live in a world
where prejudices and extremes of inequality
are defeated
inside our countries
and between different countries.
Where people live in cities and communities
that are safe, progressive,
and support everyone who lives there.
Where we replace
what we consume.
Planet where we put back
what we take out of the earth.
We live in a world that is decisively rolling back the threat of climate change.
Where we restore and protect the life in our oceans and seas.
Where we restore
and protect
life on land.
The forests,
animals,
the earth itself.
With peace between and inside countries.
Where all governments are open
and answer to us for what they do at home and abroad.
And the justice rules.
With everyone equal before the law.
Where all countries and we their people
work together
in partnerships of all kinds
to make these goals a reality for everyone, everywhere.
These are the United Nations global goals
for sustainable development.
Let's get to work.
Let's make it happen.
On the 26th of June 1945, representatives from 51 countries gathered in San Francisco to sign the United Nations Charter. The intention was to prevent a repeat of the two world wars that had killed an estimated 100 million people. Today, 193 countries have signed the Charter and regularly meet at the headquarters in Manhattan to discuss matters of international importance. However, this organization, intended to safeguard our freedoms and rights as laid out in the Charter, is by its very nature undemocratic. Which begs the question, what does the United Nations do, and can it, even unintentionally, harm us? One of the main aims of the United Nations is to broker peace in war zones and prevent genocide. To facilitate this, a multinational armed force was created in 1948 to act as peacekeepers in areas of conflict, such as the Middle East and Rwanda. As of March 2016, this army has 104,773 uniformed troops around the world, a larger force than either Canada or Australia can muster. The man in charge of this sizable force is the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, Hervé Ladsous. A French career diplomat, Ladsous was appointed by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. This means that a well-equipped armed force larger than many nations' militaries is under the direct control of an unelected official. Exactly where the force is deployed is decided by the UN Security Council. The council consists of 10 non-permanent members elected every 2 years, as well as 5 permanent members: the US, the UK, France, China, and Russia. Over 60 UN member states have never been members of the Security Council. This means 5 nations hold arbitrary influence over where peacekeepers are deployed, who the next Secretary General will be, and the legality of international military actions. The main problem with a multinational neutral peacekeeping force that intervenes in foreign affairs is that often it is not wanted by either side of a conflict. This may be why, according to an internal UN report, peacekeepers only intervened in 20% of cases to protect civilians from harm. In addition to this perceived failure in their principal mission, UN troops have been accused of misconduct against the people they are there to protect. For example, between 2013 and 2015, French UN peacekeepers allegedly sexually assaulted 99 girls in the Central African Republic. 3 of those girls were allegedly forced to have sex with animals by a UN commander. In Bosnia, peacekeepers were accused of helping traffic young women into sex slavery. Meanwhile, Pakistani peacekeepers have been found guilty of sexual abuse. With this sort of track record, the UN is finding itself unwanted in war zones, not just because of their lack of ability to end the chaos, but also due to their potential to escalate it. But if the UN is powerless to stop conflicts or is unwilling to do so, what exactly are their intentions? The budget for core UN operations in 2014 to 2015 was set at $5.5 billion. However, this excludes peacekeeping, which costs an additional $7 billion. This has led to accusations that the UN is corrupt, that the organization is being used as another plaything by the rich and powerful. And there is certainly evidence to suggest corruption has happened in UN history. In 1995, the UN established an oil-for-food program with Iraq, ostensibly to provide humanitarian aid to the beleaguered nation in exchange for Iraqi oil. However, the head of the program, Benon Sevan, was found to have corruptly benefited from bribes when he was given oil bonds in return for special favor. At around the same time, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan's son, Kojo, was accused of using his father's influence to secure a bid on a UN contract for the company he worked for. With its vast budget and independent military strength, people like author Michael T. Snyder contend that the United Nations is merely a front for the establishment of a new world order. In September 2015, the UN passed a draft agenda for global sustainability. It laid out a framework for humanity for the next 15 years. Michael Snyder alleges that, under the guise of tackling poverty and problems with the environment, causes that have universal appeal, the UN is planning to use this popular support to initiate a series of control measures over the general population. So, while the initial aims of the United Nations may have been noble, the realpolitik behind its creation has persisted to this day. It could be argued that the Big Five who sit on the Security Council pursue their own agendas, to the detriment of those they claim to represent. And certainly in the last 2 decades, the UN have proved suspiciously toothless when dealing with international conflicts. Meanwhile, reluctant peacekeepers imposed on a reluctant population can cause more problems than they solve. Therefore, it may well be that the UN isn't so much dangerous in intent, but dangerous in potential.
Dead, still living, shady reptilian characters and some discussions that rock the very foundation of the world we're living in. No, not Halloween at your grandma's house, I'm talking conspiracy theories.
Obama is set to meet with Vladimir Putin next week in New York City. That's right. Now, if you look here, look at the words that they use. Now, President Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin will meet Monday in New York. This will be their first encounter in nearly a year amid growing tensions between the two countries. So they're not going to meet, they're not going to talk, they're not going to conspire or work together. They're going to encounter each other. That sounds dangerous, doesn't it? Now, Putin is scheduled to be in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, where he will speak Monday. Now, the United Nations has different regional headquarters and headquarter districts. such as Geneva, Switzerland, Vienna, Austria, Nairobi, Kenya.
Hey everybody, Stacy on the right. I'm totally sitting here wondering what in the world is going on right now. So let me dig into this real quick. Apparently came out today that the U.S. owes black people reparations for a history of racial terrorism. Now remember, the UN represents nation states that still have slavery within their borders, but don't let me get too deep in the weeds of the problems they have in their own house before they start talking about Americans. The article is on thewashingtonpost.com, and it says a recent report by a UN-affiliated group based in Geneva has come to the conclusion, as a part of a study by the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Now, never mind that people of African descent live all over the world. There are French Africans, there are German Africans, people from Africa or the continent of Africa, because it's not a country. They live everywhere. They live all over the globe. They're in Alaska, they're in the North Pole, they're in Iceland, they're everywhere. They may not be in huge numbers, but they're there. So everywhere you're going to find black people, you may find some history of oppression, but again, don't let me get off into the weeds with facts and everything. So they are, and I'm quoting this article, it says, in particular, the legacy of colonial history, enslavement, racial subordination, segregation, racial terrorism, and racial inequality in the United States remains a serious challenge. Now, I had someone message me twice today on my Facebook page and say that this is something that's been in the works for a long time. Well, I remember. Do you remember when Mike Brown was shot 2 years ago here in St. Louis? The next year, the mom of Mike Brown, her and her current husband went to the UN and they testified about the difficulties of race in America. And at that point, I thought to myself, what foolishness is this? What business do they have going to the UN and talking anything bad about America? Well, this is what it was. And mind you, understand how these cogs fit together. This is George Soros, and he's using the UN to try to enact something here in the United States, and it's not for our benefit. Once again, black people are being used as pawns to further the goals of someone who could care less about them. There's a reason why he put, my daughter's coming in here with a whole bunch of music. There's a reason why George Soros poured $33 million into Ferguson and all of that unrest. He didn't rebuild Ferguson. He poured money into Ferguson to try to foment unrest, and it worked. And there's a reason why this UN working group was formed. There's a reason why all of this is going on. This election is not going according to plan. Most Americans, according to polling that's out today, believe Hillary Clinton's going to win the race, but most Americans don't plan on voting for her. Now, the sentiment this far out from the race usually predicts the end of the race. So whoever Americans feel will win actually wins, as opposed to whoever Americans are planning on voting for. So the enthusiasm gap that we've been talking about for the Democrats, it is there. They don't have as much enthusiasm, but everyone feels as if everything's rigged and Hillary's going to win, or somehow Trump's going to lose as opposed to her winning. This is all a part of what Soros wants, because Hillary's a sock puppet for him. She will do whatever he tells her to do. Remember, he already was controlling her movements when she was in the Secretary of State position. He was emailing her. It's all on the WikiLeaks page. Just go there and read it for yourself. He was telling Huma and the other aides when he would meet with Hillary and who she would appoint to different positions around the world for ambassadorships in foreign countries. George Soros was telling her to do that. So none of this stuff about reparations through the UN has anything to do with anybody who looks like this. It's not for my benefit. I don't need any reparations. I don't want any reparations. The people who were actually enslaved are all dead, and the people who did the enslaving are dead. And the debt for slavery was paid when we had the Civil War. All of the blood that was shed was pound for pound for what was shed during slavery. It's over. We owe nothing more. Whites don't owe us anything, and we as black people don't owe anything. We're not owed anything. That is all paid. So, and I don't care if you're a Christian or not, that's how it works. The debt has been paid. Now, slavery was an abomination, and I absolutely, I'm not for it. But what the United Nations should be doing is focusing on the 30 million people, 26 to 30 million people, most of them black, are enslaved in Arab nations around the world in the Middle East. They're enslaved right now. They're owned as property now. They're sex slaves now. Those are the people who the UN should be focused on, not well-fed, well-taken care of, well-treated, privileged Americans. The poorest American lives better than 80% of the people on this planet. So this is not about us. People who believe they're owed reparations, you're getting pimped. You're getting played. You're getting used. The same things you like to say about black conservatives, that's actually you. You're projecting. So make no mistake about it. I'm going to give you one more little bit of information. It's from, her name is Goldie Stillman, and she was saying that it's all connected to what's been happening with the UN for at least the last 1 or 2 years, because these working groups take time. So, just like any huge organization, no huge organization just pops up one day and says, we're going to do a working group and come out with a report. It takes years worth of fact-finding and information and meetings before the group can come up with their report, and then the report can then be given to someone in charge who can make a recommendation, or they can make the recommendation to the person in charge on what to do. So Goldie's the one who sent me the link to the Washington Post piece. And I just have to say, if you don't agree with me, if you're black and you feel like we're owed reparations, just for 1 second, please think about where else on this planet you can live and be and do whatever you want to be as a black person. I know it was really un-PC what that lady said in Ohio, and she lost her job, some staffer for the RNC or whoever she was working for, and she said something about if you haven't done anything with your life and you're black, it's your own fault. But we could say that about anybody. It doesn't matter what color you are, what ethnicity you are. If you're not doing anything with yourself, it's not some old crotchety white guy off in Iowa's fault. It's your own fault. All of the opportunities are right here. And you don't have to be rich. You don't have to talk a certain way. All you have to do is work. And every time you hear the word no, work harder. And within a certain period of time, you will be successful. Because successful people aren't successful because they're tall, thin, smart, pretty, white. They're successful because when they hear no, they keep working. The person who wins is the one who continues to work and improve themselves until their value is obvious, and then they receive their reward. And then they keep working, and then they receive more. It's earned. That's not received, but they get it in exchange for their work. So if you make yourself valuable, you will get anything that you set your mind to. And you can only do that here in America. So don't be used. Don't allow these people, George Soros and all these other people, to use your ethnicity, something you were born with that you cannot change. Don't allow them to use that to further their own goals, which is to elect Hillary Clinton, who, as she said, thinks you are a predator if you're black. You're naturally born that way, like an animal, and that you need to be brought to heel like a dog. Her husband thought Barack Obama should be serving them coffee and getting their luggage. Joe Biden said Obama has no dialect, no noticeable dialect, and that his hands were clean. Now, like we can help that our hands are brown and that our fingers aren't perfectly clear skinned. You can't help that if you're black. So how can Barack Obama help that his hands look that way because he's biracial? They're the racists. That's why they talk about it so much. Don't get used. The UN doesn't give two craps about you, because if they did, they'd be looking for people that look like us. They would be looking out for them and getting them out of slavery in the Arab world.
You are listening to Nonpartisan Liberty for All Radio with your host, Dave Bourne. Call in at 702-470-7664 or Skype in, username Nonpartisan Liberty for All.
Nonpartisan Liberty for All, and we are back. If you like to listen to, or not listen to because I played it, but if you like to hear, I just said the same thing. If you'd like to see that commercial about the global goals for 2030. It's called We the People for Global Goals. So you could look it up on YouTube, and there are a bunch of celebrities in there. And the way they present it, it's kind of hard to find all of them. Some of them are just obvious, like Meryl Streep is speaking, Jennifer Lopez, but others are speaking with other people. And really, to me, it's just another way to control people, and whether it's through world government or not, it's getting those ideas out there. And I believe that the U.S. essentially has the same agenda, and that the U.S. has the biggest influence on the UN as what I believe is still the richest country in the world. But even on the, and I don't know if he said this in this video, I believe it was said in the video, but I'll go through some of the stuff said. Sorry, and I'm mixing up video and audio. It was said in the audio of the clip that I played on the. It was called "How Dangerous Is the United Nations," but it went through the history, and that there are 5 countries on the UN Security Council that are permanent countries, and that's China, France, the US, UK, and Russia, and then there are 10 that are elected every 2 years. Seems kind of unfair when you think about it. So I just want to go through this real quickly, the history, which really started with the League of Nations. And I was thinking, and I wrote this out kind of as a quote, I guess, but then I thought of the banks. But it was something that I've said before, and I might even posted before, that government is the only organization that can fail or do a terrible job and be rewarded for it. If it's like, if an agency fucks up, they end up getting more money the next year. They need more people. They're never blamed for incompetence. I mean, people blame them, but I mean, they're the government. They're all together. They don't blame. I mean, they may blame internally, but they don't come out and cut, money from them because they fucked up. They give them more money. And of course, the banks did that too. So until the banks got bailed out, they were the only ones, but now the banks have gotten bailed out. So they are also, but supposedly that will not happen again. This time they'll take your money, meaning that your savings and whatever else you have in the bank. So I would be very careful about that. But just to summarize and go through the history very briefly that was mentioned in one of the clips I played, if you had missed that. They didn't talk about the League of Nations, though, but that was essentially the UN. Before there was a UN, there was a League of Nations, and the U.S. wouldn't join it. Woodrow Wilson, who, and this makes you wonder, Woodrow Wilson, who also happened to be president when the Income Tax Amendment was passed and the Federal Reserve Act. The president was Woodrow Wilson, who also wanted a United Nations, which they ended up calling League of Nations, which obviously didn't do shit because there was a World War II. So if something doesn't work, why try to redo it? I guess you could say, well, we'll try to redo it, but why? I mean, I don't know that they necessarily redid it, except that they added the United States. It was really all they did. And really what it was for is to prevent World War III. It started with 51 countries. This is all mentioned in that clip. I heard 2 different dates, same year, just one said May and one said June. I think the 26th they both had. One had May 26th, one had June 26th, whatever. 1945. This was right after the war started with the 51 countries. I don't know if all those 51 countries were already in the League of Nations. And as you had probably heard if you listened to the clips, there were 104 troops. I did not know this as of March 2016 that the UN controls. However, according to somebody I know made a statement that said, 10,000, not Al-Qaeda, but ISIS soldiers would defeat them, meaning they're non-trained, pushovers, I guess. I don't know. I can't validate that. I don't know enough about their troops. I would think if they had fucking AK-47s, just like pretty much what Al-Qaeda and ISIS and most of a lot of countries have, and I'm familiar with both an AK-47 or a version of it and the AR-15, which the U.S. Army uses the fully automatic. It's a lot easier to... I think the accuracy with the AR-15 is a lot better, and it's more lightweight. But supposedly an AK-47, you can do whatever the fuck you want to that thing, and it will still fire. Plus, it fires bigger rounds, so it's going to do more damage. And you have an AR-15 that fires, smaller rounds. What would actually be perfect, and they make these, is Ruger has the exact same AR-15 that shoots the ammo of an AK-47, the 7.62 by, I think, 36 millimeter. So it only carries 20 in the magazine instead of 30, but you could probably get a bigger magazine. I don't know if it could handle that many shots that fast. That's usually why they're smaller, but I'm sure it could. So, and of course, it's not automatic, so it's just how fast you can pull the trigger. But that I like to shoot that and see how good that is. So at some point, I'd probably just buy it because I have the other one, and I shouldn't have said that, but it's nice. And the only difference would be the changing, it would shoot the higher caliber, and then I could share that with my AK-47. Anyway, supposedly AK-47s can, you can do anything to them, and they're going to shoot. I had trouble with shooting brass where it jammed, but I mean, it didn't break or anything. Although the safety, when I took it apart, one of the times the safety fucking broke off, and then I put it back on, but it doesn't work now. So anyway, the Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping, which is appointed by the Secretary General, which is now Ban Ki-moon, is in charge of those troops. I can understand them not being well trained or well equipped, but really, I mean, if they have, and I'm sure they have automatic AK-47s, and ISIS, a lot of those fighters, they're guys they went out and fucking hired. They're not, not every single one of them are these lunatics that can cut heads off. I mean, who knows if that really even happened. I mean, I don't know. There were videos, but there was a lot of questions about that. So, and there was the issue of peacekeepers, because that's what they're for. Peacekeepers accused of various crimes. Now, if their whole point was to keep peace, their whole purpose, the United Nations, what the fuck are they doing all these things that they're doing, like writing about sustainable development and reparations and shit like that? If that was their goal, which supposedly it was essentially make sure that there's not a World War III and try to avoid all wars, period. So their purpose was really to bring nations together so they could kind of hash out their differences. And for the most part, and then make agreements based on that if they needed to, but not to come up with things like, World Sustainable Development or Agenda 21 or anything like that. So just like every other organization, they're created for one purpose. And, any government organization or government affiliated organization, which they are affiliated with the government because governments are members of the UN. So currently they have 193 countries. And again, they're supposed to safeguard freedoms and rights from wars and broker peace in war zones. Where did that safeguard freedom and rights? I think now that was what, because that wasn't their original, Now they're trying to safeguard freedom and rights, but it was really more to broker peace in war zones. So this is what they're doing now, as opposed to when they were formed, was really to make sure there's not going to be a World War III. So now they're going and trying to protect individual freedom. Well, they're not. That's a bunch of bullshit, because none of the things that they list really have to do with freedom for the most part. Maybe one or two, and we'll go back and look at those. But I don't look at making sure people have sustainable jobs or sustainable food. The UN is one of those, I don't even know what you'd call them, organizations, I guess, that focuses on positive rights and freedoms. So like when they say safeguard rights and freedoms, which again, that's a recent thing, not a when it started thing in 1945. But, and so is broker peace in war zones. It was supposed to be more, these countries got together and met and, worked out their differences, whatever, made sure that there weren't, wars if they could avoid them, and definitely not a World War III. But especially with the nuclear bombs that a lot of countries have now. But they look at freedom and rights totally differently than what freedom and rights are. We've had discussions on the show, or maybe not discussions, but, well, actually I think discussions, but we've talked about negative and positive freedoms and rights. And I've talked about it with other people, and just most of the people that I was talking to actually agreed with me. So I guess that's still a discussion, but that's what we do on the show, is promote the ideas of freedom and liberty. Not, I'm not like other shows where I want to have people on that disagree with me so we can sit and argue in order to get listeners. There's so many shows that do that. If you want those opinions, turn your TV on to any channel and you can get them. Anyway, so again, to just briefly mention negative and positive rights, and I always get this wrong, but negative rights, I finally got it right, are what real rights and freedoms are. Meaning the right to defend yourself, the right to put what you want in your body. They're rights and freedoms that don't involve guarantees from other people for the most part. And I mean, well, maybe that's not the best way to say it, but you don't really need anything from somebody else in the most part. Like, you don't need somebody to do something for you. So they would say a right is healthcare is a right. Now, healthcare requires the actual, what would you call it? The work, I had a better word for it, but of a doctor or the there was a word I had in my head that I just totally forgot. The labor of a doctor or a nurse or whatever medical professional, it requires their labor to do that. So do you have a right to their labor? No, you don't. And they'll do that with a whole bunch of things. The one I bring up all the time, I brought it up 50 times already, is that they say they have the right to peace and the right to live. And they bring that up. And what they mean, and they literally mean this when they say that about world peace. World peace means you don't own a gun. And the one thing that I wrote it down in my notes, but I didn't mention so far, is the small arms treaty that Obama signed. Now, different people have differing opinions. I think I said that wrong, but on what that exactly means. But what I saw as it meant when they referred to small arms, that it is an international law and something leading to international law banning citizens, or I hate the word citizens, individuals from having guns unless you're part of a government agency. So other people disagree and say that had to do with arms trafficking and things like that. But it almost had to do with, it mentions, and I got to go to the document, and I think it's very short and open to interpretation, and that's the problem. But arms trafficking, I think, could be somebody selling somebody else a couple guns. I mean, small arms are not something a midget has. No, small arms, I'm sorry, I apologize to little people. Small arms are not like, when I hear small arms, I thought they were talking about like explosives and shit like that. That's what I initially would think. But no, small arms, they're talking about guns. So and regardless of that treaty, the UN is anti-gun, except for, of course, if you work for the government, then that's fine. Only governments should have guns, and individuals should not, unless they, of course, work for the government. But they, when they talk about those positive rights, about the right to peace and live in a peaceful society and have world peace, and I think that's in here specifically about world peace. I'd have to find it, but there's something, healthy lives and promote well-being, but that's more about food and exercise and stuff. But I think there's something that has to do with, safe. They say make cities and human settlements safe. I know in the original one, and it may be in the details and not in the actual, promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build efficient, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So in that, of course, what I read is we want to ban guns, and some people will look at me like you're a nut. You don't know what you're talking about. But if I go to that goal, which I did, because they're calling them goals, sustainable development goals in this section, where it just initially lists them. But if I go to the details, I guarantee you it will go more into things which which I did before, that will make you come to that conclusion. And they want people to essentially not be armed, and they look at peaceful as, you know, people are not armed, not that governments are not armed. And that's one of the problems, obviously, because they're looking again at these negative rights. So you look at all, I mean, a lot of these things, and I'll read through this again and talk more about it at another time also, but it's like end poverty in all forms. Well, they say that you have the right to live, to food, to a healthy life. All of these things that they list, they're looking at as rights. But you don't have a right to that, or it's not a freedom. Now, it's a freedom to be able to obtain that without government stopping you, or a freedom, a right to be able to buy whatever food you want without government interference. It's not a right that you have food. It's not, because where does that food come from? And this is what people don't think about, for one, and that's why you get a lot of millennials, no offense, but you get a lot of younger people in their late teens and early 20s that have never been out on their own, have never had to pay bills, don't realize that, and even that, they think, well, that shouldn't be that way. But if you really think about it, it should, because this is why. Because everything that you have gotten or obtained or bought, somebody had to put some labor into that. Now, are they not owed for their labor? So if you want to take healthcare, for example, if a doctor, and the U.S. government has fucked up the whole healthcare system so bad. Before I was born, I don't even know what it was like. I got to find out from somebody that's old enough to tell me. But from what I understand, I mean, in the 60s, you didn't need insurance because you could afford to pay for a fucking doctor or an operation or all of these things. And I know Ron Paul has talked about that, being a physician, you know, back years ago. And what happened, I have no idea. There's so many things that come up. And that's why, you know, for me, I wouldn't say harder than most people, because there's a lot of people that do shows that work full-time jobs. But I have, for me and people like me that are trying to fight for true freedom and liberty and doing shows, and we're not getting paid for these shows, and we're working full-time. And the only reason I bring up we're not getting paid is we have to work another job because we're not getting paid. So we can't put all our time into it and do all this research, or hire people to help us. Like Rush Limbaugh probably has like 20 people on staff. Now, he, of course, is an extreme example because he has a multi-million-dollar show. But the local show in Las Vegas of that douchebag that lives here, Wayne Allen Root, probably, now I know he writes books and does this, and I'm sure he doesn't do shit for his show, that he just has, you know, the station, he tells, you know, he has interns and this and that, and they just do all the research for him, and there you go. And when it comes to what's going on in the news, and sets all that up for him. When people like, not just me, but other people that have shows out there that don't have the time to do as much as they'd like and read half the day about what they're going to talk about and do all these things because they have other jobs, and, you know, they can't get people to work for free to be researchers, although I did have somebody for a little while helping me out a little. But, and some of them can, I guess. I've had times where I've had people that co-hosted, you know, and stuff like that. And of course, Ellen does her show and I don't pay her. But we're at a disadvantage, and there's so many things that come up that I wish I had the time to really get into the detail. And I could, you know, do a 4-hour show and come at these motherfuckers from so many different ways. I mean, the government. Come at them from, you know, all these different aspects, which I do anyway, because I know a little about a lot, but I don't have enough information a lot of the time because I don't have the time to get all the detail to intelligently speak about it. And if I do talk about something that I don't know enough about, I'm going to get called out on it. And I have before. Although I thought I did enough research on it, I kind of disagreed on that one. I just thought I came off badly. I agree with that. I thought I came off really badly. But I don't have the time to put in, you know, and I don't want to take just a fucking Wikipedia page that is all of Wikipedia is entered in by people, just regular people. So to me, I need multiple sources, multiple articles, and then you look at those, you analyze those, you look at how it relates to other things, and then you draw your own conclusions as well. And the conclusion I draw with the UN and what it's doing here is really presenting the agenda that is parallel with the U.S. agenda, which is why I think this report came out when it did. Now, about reparations. Now, it's been talked about before, reparations, but this is not just about reparations. This was a report about Black people specifically being their rights being violated, that they did a study on people of African descent in the U.S. and are concerned about human rights violations. Now, I would say they're on the outside looking in, but there are some human rights violations. They talk about the police. But one thing that people forget, and this doesn't make anything better or improve the system, and anybody that knows me knows I'm straight up anti-police. I think the police should not exist. But most of these people do get money in civil hearings. So we get fucked on all fronts, right? So we get and I don't want to even put it that way because that's kind of a fucked up way to put it as far as the person getting killed. I mean, that's a tragic death where somebody gets murdered by a cop. That's bad enough. Now, the family deserves money, but they don't get it from the police budget. They don't get it from the cops. It's very hard to sue a cop individually, although people try to attach them as well. They have so many protections legally that it never comes out of, you know, they don't lose any money on it. I think they should be totally bankrupted. But it gets paid by the government, which is the taxpayers. So then people get fucked on that too because they have to pay for what the police did. Now, granted, I still think the people deserve the money because the in cases where police just straight up murder people. But if those people are getting money that way, you wouldn't give them reparations because that's their compensation. Although money can never, of course, bring somebody back. It's not a, here's your, it's like a consolation. It's something that, okay, you got money out of it, but it doesn't bring that person back unless, you really didn't give a fuck about your son or wife or whatever, whoever the person that died. And I guess that's could be more common in married couples, to be honest, like them not giving a fuck and then getting money out of it. And like, damn, I got some money out of it. And I wanted to get rid of this motherfucker anyway. But most of the time, the parent, at least the parent that is involved in the kid's life, or they're not a kid, but the person's life, would obviously much rather have that person there, and then of course there's whether it's the parents that get the money, or if they have kids and the money goes to wife and kids, or there are women that get murdered by police too. So whether it goes to the husband and kids or parents or whatever, they deserve that money, but they're getting that money that way. So I don't know that you can base a whole, if they're basing reparations off of things like that as well, and people are being compensated through the court system, then you can't, it shouldn't really be looked at that way. And of course, they talk about in this one article, and this is from January, and then they came out in September. That's why people started talking about it recently. And I think that's why people started talking more about this than they have in the past when they talked about reparations for slavery specifically. Now, as I was saying earlier, I mean, reparations should have came a long time ago to actual slaves, and I think part of them should have came from plantation owners. They should have had their plantation, and I don't know what happened to plantation owners after the Civil War, but they should have had their plantations taken and split up, because from what I understand, a lot of those plantations were fucking big. And another thing that somebody had brought up is the fact that, first of all, the majority of people did not own slaves, not just because they didn't want to. So I don't know that I'm going to give credit. And first of all, we're only talking about the South. Now, that doesn't mean in the North treatment wasn't bad in certain areas, and I don't know enough about how, I read Frederick Douglass's book and his autobiography, and how he was formerly a slave, and he was what I got out of it was he was a highly respected member of society in Massachusetts when he finally had gotten away and became a scholar. And I don't know what he did, but he was very well respected. So I don't know how it was. I know there was still segregation in schools, because I was thinking about this today. So how bad was it in the North? And was it just segregation? I mean, I know I've seen racism in Boston, recently. I mean, not that recently, but, high school, which wasn't that long ago. I mean, it wasn't the type of racism like people getting killed or hung or something, but, it was words and I genuinely saw hate. Now, I didn't see hate like they wanted people to die, but I saw hate from not a lot of people, but there were people that had that hate. And that's how I define racism. Now, I know different people define things differently, and the word racist gets thrown around, and people say racism is about the institutional racism and all of that, and power and all that stuff. And I don't look at it that way. I look at racism as people that hate other people strictly based on their race, the color of their skin and their features. And that's where it gets dangerous. I don't necessarily think that, as much as I, think cops are pieces of shit, that they hate black people. I think, as I've said before, they stereotype and discriminate. I think that they look at black people as criminals. So they might dislike them or have that, the same attitude they'd have towards someone they look at as a criminal. So I think that it's more that than anything, that they're fucking pussies and they think every black person's a criminal, so they got to protect themselves, and they're quicker to pull a gun on somebody they think is a criminal. And I think cops look at me and think I'm a criminal, and that's, or have in the past, and that may have accounted for things that have happened. There's also the cops that, it's not just about that. I mean, you have old ladies and people that just get harassed, and the power trip. The cops are on that whole power trip thing, that they treat everybody that way, no matter how you act towards them. So it's gone beyond all of that. But as far as the UN, that woman who was black that I played a clip of did have a good point about, who are the UN to really say shit when, look what they're doing. But should reparations at this time be given? I mean, there was discrimination after that, especially in the South. Should it be given as a blanket to anybody who is of black descent, African American descent? No. No. And should it even be given out at all at this point? And how would you find descendants of, well, if you're a descendant of a slave, then you get something? And see, the reason, if you kind of look at things and you look at what's going on now with government media and the U.S. government, what's going on in the UN and with this, it's kind of replicating what's going on there. Because they talk about all the black people getting killed, unarmed black people getting killed, but there's a whole bunch of unarmed white people that were killed as well, or people that were armed with non-lethal weapons, or situations that the police had no right to shoot them, or they beat that homeless man to death. And there's a lot of them, because I've looked at them and looked at the details. And that girl just kills me, because she was so young, and she was kind of attractive too, actually. But she was not a kindergarten teacher, a preschool teacher, 19 years old. And I can't think of her name. I always forget it. Maybe I subconsciously want to. But she was shot point blank when the cop jumped on her windshield and shot her and killed her, because she was at a party out in the woods, and the cop claims he told them to stop, but you can see on the dash cam the cop and then the cop walking towards their car, and they easily that's a valid point that if they couldn't hear him, because you could see easily that he was further enough away if they had their windows up, which I think it was raining, and music on, or even they were just talking, that they didn't hear him and they just kept going. And they probably didn't want to stop anyway, so they're like, well, did he say something? I don't know. And then he comes in, and even by his injury, which I had said, his foot got run over. Like he jumped in front of the wheel and then jumped on the windshield and then shot her point blank and said he was gonna, she wouldn't stop and he was gonna kill her, even though all the witnesses in the car say different. And it's, you know, he just had to say, I fear for my life. And, you know, the innocent girl gets killed. And I know they say, well, they tested her later and said, and I don't even know if I believe this shit anymore. Like they had just said, one of the guys who was killed, which shouldn't have been killed, where people tasered him and the one woman shot him and killed him, that he was on PCP. How do you know if that's even true? Bill Clinton had a coroner in Arkansas, and this is a fact, that covered up, and you can look at this. This had to do with Iran-Contra, and when planes full of cocaine were flying into Mena, Arkansas, and I did shows on this, so you can go back and listen to them, and they were only a few weeks ago. They're not that old. And he basically kept this coroner on because he owned this coroner. So I don't know. They said, I mean, and even if she did, it's not a big deal that they said marijuana in her system, and who knows when she actually smoked it, because they don't know. It could have been weeks ago, or she could have had a couple, you know, she could have been at that party for hours, and that her blood alcohol level, I don't think it was even over the legal limit, or if it was like just barely over the legal limit. It was right at the, you know, so it's not like she was wasted neither. So of course they bring that up. They don't bring up anything about the officer and his record. But either way, it's irrelevant. And I wish I could think of her name. I keep thinking of Jessica, Samantha Ramsey is her name. So you can look that up. And he was charged with nothing. They put him in front of a grand jury. He said, you know, I was in fear for my life, blah, blah, blah. Cops don't get charged, man. And when they do, look what happened with the cops in Baltimore, because they're being prosecuted by someone who doesn't want to prosecute them. And then they have a judge giving the jury instructions who doesn't want them found guilty. So same thing in a grand jury, which is just to indict them. They have the prosecutor doesn't want them prosecuted, and the judge doesn't either. So that's how it works. If they even get past there, they're usually found not guilty. You know, occasionally you'll see a cop found guilty, but it's very rare. Even the ones that beat the homeless man to death, they beat him to death, they got off. They were indicted. Because I think there was no way that you can just not indict them and keep any illusion of freedom. I don't know how you can keep an illusion of freedom now with every cop gets off. But it's not, what happens is that a lot of black people that don't know what's going on, that 4 to 5 people a day are getting killed of all races, and the police are getting off when they kill white people as well, think that, or they just hear stuff from government media the way they have it planned out, is, you know, because government controls what I call government media, which is, you know, people refer to mainstream media, that it's the police. It's that police get away with pretty much everything, unless, you know, it's somebody that has to be, one of the elite. And that would probably never happen because the cop would know in the process, or, well, I guess I was going to say after they, do something, but they would make it evident somehow, I would think. So, yeah, or, those people, because I'm talking about the elite, those people run around with bodyguards and a bunch of other people. So, it's not going to happen. And another thing that I was watching this documentary on between rich and poor people, and how I guess Chelsea and Staten Island, New York, and I'm not that familiar with New York, but they kind of bought out, like gentrification bought out all these places, and they're still like and raised the price. And there's a rich school, and right across the street is the projects. And that one of the kids that lived there, who was actually going to college and everything, was even saying, it's not even about race, really. It's about class. And there's a higher percentage of white people that have money. But what about, so in looking at this report and them factoring in all these other things. Now, first of all, the police thing, most of those people get compensated through the courts. They do. That's how they, try to make people happy. I don't know how, they know the person that murdered their loved ones walking around, but, we'll give you money because we don't give a fuck about money. They try to shut you up or whatever. And so you take that out of it. And also, like I said, you have all races that's happening to. You can't really count the police. But you do have other things that happened after slavery and Jim Crow and what happened during the civil rights movement and whatnot. But what part of that was government, which some of it was, and what part of that was racist white people? So definitely slavery was government, and a lot of these laws, the segregation laws, it was all government. But a lot of the killings were actually partially government, because if you consider the sheriff's office back then, in the 60s, and they were, police were killing people back then, and hanging people with the Klan. So I think it's hard, though, to base it upon, those things. I think slavery is clear cut that reparations are due, right after the fact. And I wouldn't have a problem with that, except that nobody that's alive today owns slaves. And as I was saying, a very small, I don't know the percentage of slave owners, but your average person didn't own a slave because they couldn't afford it. It wasn't like every person owned a slave. No one owned a slave in the states that it wasn't legal. And nobody owned a slave in the South that didn't have money. And then look at all the rednecks now that are poor and don't have money. So I don't even know what percentage of people actually own slaves. That's not to say that there weren't a lot of slaves, because of the people that did own them, a lot of them owned a whole lot. So I think it was just more concentrated, where you had the slave owners, instead of, 1 million people or 10 million people owning one slave each, you had 1 million people owning, or 100,000 people owning 30 slaves each on average or more. So I think it was more concentrated from what I've seen and heard from history. But to go back and do that now, you're essentially holding people accountable that had nothing to do with it. And you're the whole country at that same time. I mean, you'd have to go back, and this wouldn't even be fair neither, but you'd have to go back on both sides and say, well, your relatives were slave owners. But unless they had money now, if they had family money because of slave owners, so say that, their relatives were slave owners and now they're still millionaires. I mean, that's really the only case I would say to, have their tax money or a lawsuit or something like that. But how can the people now be responsible for what people that they were related to, hundreds of years ago? How can you hold them responsible? And that's the whole thing. And nobody that's alive today was a slave. And depending on where you lived and your age, the amount of racism that you might have experienced is not much compared to what they went through. Yeah, you can say people can call you names, or there's not so much of outside of the government, courts and police, there's not a huge amount of expressed racism. It's more, people keep it quiet or talk to their white friends or something. But it's names, or somebody gets followed around in a store, which has happened to me, or can't get a cab or doesn't get a job. But you get to a point where people have the right to, again, it's the concept of freedom as long as they're not interfering with your freedom. So if they're not attacking you or stealing from you, they have the right to feel that way. And the same with black people. If they don't like white people, now I don't agree with white people or anybody who doesn't like somebody because of their race. But all I'm saying is people have the right to. And that's where the UN document, to me, gets into the Harrison Bergeron thing. Is it's like world peace and everybody loves each other and all of this shit that is not realistic. And it's not just because of things like racism. It's like people don't like people based on their personalities sometimes. Sometimes people just don't like people. They just, the look on their face. I mean, it's ridiculous shit the way some people are, but people sense things about people and just don't like certain people or don't like certain things they do or the way they dress or whatever. And that's their right to do that as long as they don't take it to another level. Now, if they take it to another level, obviously, where they're attacking them, then that's another issue, or they're stealing from them. But they have the right to do that. And going back to the UN, I guess to leave to really summarize my opinion on reparations, I think they should have been done a long time ago. I think to do them now, you can't really do it. Not to say that they're not deserved. I mean, somebody deserves something for what slaves had to go through. But I don't know how you do that now. I think it should have been done back then, and through both the government and the plantation owner. And I think this is being done now because of the agenda of using and exploiting black people that are getting killed by police. Now, again, white people are getting killed by police too, but focusing on that and creating groups like Black Lives Matter and having them funded by these white progressives who are putting their agenda, the white progressives' agenda, within their platform along with other things and exploiting what's going on. And this is another thing to add to it. And at least from the side of the reparations. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. I don't think you can really do anything except as if a case comes up where you feel that you were wronged, like when cops murder people, you sue them, and from what I understand, most of the time people are getting money for that. And I mean, that's really all you can do. Besides, I think people should look at what's really going on, because to look at the police and have somebody murdered by a cop that you love and then support a communist organization or a organization that's fronting for communism. Communism is going to make your life 20 times worse. You're going to have more police and more laws, and it doesn't go together. So you can either have those police running your life and having to obey them, or you can have socialism and communism where, you get, money and maybe free housing and, the same redistribution, and everybody's made equal as much as possible. But you're restricted on everything. The government controls everything, meaning they have people, enforcers, whether they call them police or they call them something else, which I bet you they would change the name so people wouldn't, association. They wouldn't look at them as police, but that's what they would be. So you can have one or the other. You can't have both. So that's really my, I guess, comments on the reparations aspect of it. Now, going back to, Agenda 21 is really about control in world government, really, and getting people to install a world government, which would be a huge oligarchy, because, of course, if you have 8 billion people and you have, say, 5,000 running the world, you have no say. And that's how it is now in the U.S. and probably most other countries as well. But people just don't realize it. But a world government, makes it a lot more obvious. But some people want that as well. They want a world government. But everything is dictated to you by the bureaucracy, just like is happening now. So that's why I'm looking at this, and it's mirroring what the U.S. wants to do, essentially, within the U.S. itself. So I don't know if it's do this in the U.S. From there, we move slowly to a world government and do the same things, because that's what it is it's instead of people, take countries, and it's this country just giving resources, redistribution of wealth among countries, and making every country equal and having this country fund this. But you have to give up what you have and what you worked for to do this in this country. And then you say, well, how come this country is so fucked up in the first place? Well, it depends on the country. Part of it may be that it was a territory of another country like England that fucking sucked its resources dry, and then, you know, it was left in shambles. But at the same time, you know, how come you have a country like the U.S. that is a young country, and in 240 years, you know, if you're counting from 1776, is the richest and, I guess, most successful country in the world up to this point. And a lot of people will say because of its freedom, although at the time it was probably, as I talk about levels of freedom, had a much higher level of freedom than all these other countries. But that still doesn't give you the freedom that you were born with. It gives you a higher level of freedom. It's like on the documentary I mentioned that, I think I mentioned it, I might have not, but of people becoming citizens, or I think I started to, that they look at the U.S. as this great country because they came from shit. One woman was talking about how she came from a communist country. And one woman actually said how they don't have, or not woman, guy from Jordan said, well, they don't have checkpoints everywhere and all this shit. And I'm like, it depends where you're at, motherfucker, because they're starting to have more and more checkpoints, and for things other than DUI. I heard that in some states they have license checkpoints to see if you have a license. And he said, because they were asking, why do you like the United States? So they're like, the freedom. Well, your country must have been pretty fucked up. But just because something is fucked up does not mean that you should say, well, at least we're better than this. That's like saying, well, you know, you should stay with your husband because he only beat you. You know, this other lady's husband, you know, killed her. So, you know, your husband's a lot better than hers. No, it's, and at the same time, that level of freedom is going down and down and down. And of course, they, I believe, have a plan in which the ultimate goal is to control every aspect of your life. And that's what it is. And the UN, and you see how they get all the celebrities behind it, but they are trying to do it and make it sound great. Yeah, end poverty everywhere and, you know, all of these things. But it's not as easy as it sounds. And you're talking about, again, it would take a lot of control. Make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. What do you think would go into that? Besides urban planning and probably having those nice little 400 square foot apartments. Banning guns, having police, a bigger presence of police, you know, these type of things, having government more involved in your life, which people keep forgetting about the fact that we're being spied on. Do I have to remind you every fucking minute? I should just have a thing that scrolls across the screen that says something about the fact that all of this is being recorded. It's nice how some states have laws that you have to tell somebody you're recording. But that doesn't apply to the government. So they go through these sustainable development goals and then go into detail. But I think this all kind of started with I mean, they might have had this in the works way before that, and I'm sure they did. But as far as releasing the documents with the Agenda 21, which had to do with sustainable development and all of that shit, a lot of the same type things that here I have the chapter. I mean, Agenda 21 is called the same thing, for sustainable development, and it was from the 1992. It's actually called Agenda 21. It's 351 pages, and it goes through social and economic dimensions, a conservative and management of resources for development, strengthening the role of major groups, means of implementation, and that's where I should really go. But the sections of means of implementation are financial resources and mechanisms, transfer of environmentally sound technology, cooperation and capacity building, science for sustainable development, like climate change, promoting education, public awareness and training, national mechanisms and international cooperation for capacity building in developing countries, international institution arrangements, international legal instruments and mechanisms, information for decision making. So, and then it goes into the details of that, but that's a pretty long document. I would suggest looking at both of them and, you know, seeing how they have progressed, which I will try to do, and maybe do a show on Agenda 21 versus what they've done in this 35 or 33 page document of sustainable development for the next 15 years. But I remember reading it, and I don't know what changes they've made because I haven't read the final draft. But I remember reading it in, like I said, I think like 2014 at some point, and coming across it. It might have even been before I started doing the show, and then I ended up doing a show on it later. But it was pretty scary, you know, when I first saw it. I was like, what the fuck? And of course you had John Podesta was the guy from the U.S. I don't know what position he was in at the time, but a lot of people might have heard his name. He was the representative from the U.S. who had signed off on this. So, and again, I think this is pretty much what the U.S. wants to do, because again, the goal is controlling every aspect of everybody's lives. And you can do that by, and they want to do that by, you know, socialism and making everybody as equal as possible. And they talk about that too, you know, it's like making everybody equal, and that's a right that everybody is equal. And no, not everybody is equal. Everybody should be treated equally under the law. And really, I believe that the only thing that should be equal is that you have the freedom to do whatever you want except assault, rape, or do anything physical to another person or their property. So everybody should have that equal freedom, including self-defense, and being able to, you know, lethal self-defense if it calls for it in that circumstance. That being the only way that you have a right to violate physically assaulting somebody. But besides that, that's really all you're owed, and it's essentially natural law. But that's the only, you know, freedom. And there are a bunch of freedoms that come under that. But if you want to summarize it, you know, like the freedom to put whatever you want in your body, the freedom, you could get more detailed in it. But if you were to summarize it, I mean, that's what it is. It's not the freedom to have people help you. It's not the freedom to have people give you money if you can't afford food. It's not the freedom to have people feed you. It's none of that, because those aren't freedoms or the right. Those aren't rights. You don't have a right to be fed or be, I mean, we've talked about, okay, you know, if you're a kid and your parents and whatever, there's certain, I think, obligations that they have. But besides that, speaking of, if we're speaking of just adults, although I believe kids, their rights are totally fucking trashed all the time. But that's all we have for tonight, all the time we have for tonight. I could talk for a lot longer, but I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And tomorrow we will be back with Ken Shorgen of the Daily Economist, also of Ken Shorgen on YouTube. So check out his YouTube channel and his website, dailyeconomist.com. And we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks a lot, everybody. Take care. Have a good night.
Do something, do it. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, then the courts will figure it out.
We don't get to take the enforcement. But at the end of the day, each and every man should go home safe. Sometimes the use of force is necessary. You need to comply with the police officer. The way the
government and what they're doing, and would somehow defend it. I don't know. You know, I know all the bullshit defenses that people use because they all say the same thing. You know, it's, well, you have to help support the community and you have to pay taxes to help support that, and all this bullshit that each point can be refuted down to the detail. I mean, there are some points that you could say, well, what would you do about this and what would you do about that? And does everyone have the specific answer? I mean, there's a lot of answers and there's a lot of options and there's a lot of different ways to do things. Just like when they wrote the Constitution, everything wasn't mapped out. And now they come up with, they still come up with situations where they don't know how to handle it, and then they make a stupid fucking law for it. So anyway, tonight we're going to be talking all about the UN and their agenda, their revised agenda that's supposed to run until 2030. The specific name of it I do have somewhere. I actually have this document you can download, Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Global Action, which is the final draft of the outcome document for the UN Summit to adopt the post-2015 development agenda. And I had went over this before, maybe a couple years ago when I had started the show, or maybe a year into the show or something like that, where I actually went through and read most of the document. It's not that long, but it's long enough. I mean, it's 30-something pages, and when you're reading something like that, it's just monotonous, and it's, you know, going through all this shit, and at the same time, you're trying to really figure out the meaning behind what they're trying to say. And I mention this a lot, but I don't really go into details. I mentioned how they want to have all the rich countries, and it actually spelled it out in the draft that I read. I don't know if they've taken it out of this one. I went through it, but I didn't read the whole thing. But they were planning on the richer countries giving to the poorer countries. So it's based on things. It's kind of based on what the government agenda is now, to be honest. It's based on things like redistribution of wealth, making everybody equal. It's something you would see in one of those fucking scary movies in the future. that are not supposed to be scary in the terms of a horror movie, but are scary because they're about just making people equal, like Harrison Bergeron. I don't know if people have read that short story. I think it was Kurt Vonnegut who had wrote that, where they actually put on, and I've talked about this before, but they put on these bands on people. They actually, bands on their head, meaning they actually made a, I think it was like a TV movie, or I don't know if it wasn't an after school special, but I think it was a TV movie that might have aired on like HBO or something. And it had Sean Astin in it. It probably came out, I'm thinking late 90s. I remember reading this story in school, but the movie was a lot more hard hitting, in my opinion. And really, they should have made an actual feature film off of this and added to it, made a film based off the short story that changed a lot of the things, because I think the movie was only an hour. I don't know if it was actually a movie per se, and I could be wrong. It could be a full length, but I mean, you could make like a 2.5 hour blockbuster movie about this. Of course, they wouldn't make a blockbuster about it because it's exactly what they want to do. I don't know that they want to do it in the same way, but what they did was they took these things that they would put on their heads that they had invented that would make people stupider. So it would suppress your intelligence. And Sean Astin was just so smart that it just broke, basically. It couldn't contain his brain. That rhymes. I'm going to put that in a rap song. But he must have this view. And it could have just been, hey, what if this happened, and it would be interesting. And usually that's not the case. But I remember in film school where in film theory and criticism, it was everything meant something. And I used to think, well, what if, and I still think this, what if this really didn't mean shit? It just fit nicely. Like, I didn't think every little detail stood for something. The professor would go through, well, this and like Jaws or something. I remember we watched like some scenes from that, and this means this, and this is a metaphor for this, and whatever. And it's like, okay, I buy into some of that, actually a lot of it, but as somebody who had to write a script for school for a full length feature film, and I thought about that, because they teach you that, and then you start thinking about, well, maybe I can make this mean this, and I can have this, but I didn't go to that extent where every little fucking detail meant something. So even in that, it could have been a story that he just came up with, because I guess he did a lot of satire. Again, I don't know enough about him to really know, but I did hear that, so I'll have to look into that. If okay, this is just a note from Wikipedia. It says that he theorized that the story was a satire on American Cold War misunderstandings of communism and socialism. See, I didn't take it that way at all. I honestly took it because it's almost a reality now. So it was, I mean, parts of it were joke-like. Even in the movie, especially in the book or in the story, they had some pictures of like how like the good looking people were, made to look fucked up and whatever, and, with masks and made to look stupid and things like that. And it was kind of weird in that sense. But later on, when I always looked at it, I looked at these couple things. And in a genre that it says that he's known for is political fiction. So I'll have to do some more research about him and see, and maybe I'll even do a show. It would be an interesting show about writers or, even filmmakers that are, don't believe in government or made movies or writings about these types of things. But the way I took it was literally making everybody equal and but the part that to me really wasn't a joke is also that you had that oligarchy really. And at the time I didn't, even when I saw the movie when I was like 18 or 19 or something, I didn't know the definition of an oligarchy. I knew, I guess, what a group of people running the government would be, or that I had probably thoughts of, people with money get away with a lot of shit and get away with more than people that don't have money because we didn't have money. I mean, we weren't poor like in poverty. I didn't grow up in poverty, but didn't have money. I mean, lived in an apartment until, I didn't have my own room till I was 21, but it's not like I was in a room with like 5 people neither. I mean, just my brother. But I lived with my parents till I was 24, and I'm almost giving away my age. But the last like 3 years I lived with them, I finally had my own room, which was like, oh my God, I felt like I grew up in jail. And that's more about my father. But so we grew up like, I wouldn't even say we were middle class because we didn't have a house. We always had food. We had clothes. We didn't have to share pants, like I hear about people that live in poverty. We weren't close to poverty. Okay. So I don't want to exaggerate when I say we didn't have money. We didn't go on vacations. I didn't go on a plane till I paid for that. Or actually they might have. Because he was so smart, they took him to the underground people that were really running the whole country. So the president was elected via lottery, literal like playing the lottery. And I don't think you got to play. I think they just like selected, you're the president. And because it didn't matter. People don't really mention this that much, and I'm really surprised. I don't think I've ever heard anybody mention Harrison Bergeron. And it's been, like I said, the story, which was, from what I remember when I read it, I'm going to look it up right now, it was short, and the movie, didn't get a lot of exposure, but it was on, either HBO or Showtime. And I never really heard anybody mention this because you would think even supposed, conservatives would mention this because it's a metaphor for communism to an extent and socialism, making everybody equal. But at the same time, it's a metaphor for an oligarchy. It's pretty much what they're trying to do now in a sense. So I'm surprised I never heard anybody mention it. I may have once or twice, but not as much as, 1984 is mentioned all the time. And I don't know, to me, I didn't read the book, but I did see the movie. I have it on DVD. And maybe because it was over hyped to me, I don't know. I just expected more. So it was a they call it satirical and dystopian science fiction short story by Kurt Vonnegut. This is according to Wikipedia. originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and the story was republished in the author's Welcome to the Monkey House collection in 1968. And I don't remember what grade I had read this in, but I guess it takes place in 2081. Amendments to the Constitution dictate that all Americans are fully equal and not allowed to be smarter, better looking, or more physically able than anyone else. And the handicap or general agents enforce the equality laws, forcing citizens to wear handicaps. I forgot about this. Yeah, masks for people who are too beautiful, radios inside the ears of intelligent people, and heavy weights for the strong or athletic. So Harrison Bergeron was intelligent, and he would have to wear the bands. But I think in the movie, they had actually everybody had to wear the bands, no matter what, if you were smart or not. Like everybody in his class. I remember the main parts of the movie because I only seen it once, and it came out in '95 on Showtime. Made a full length made for TV adaptation with Sean Astin, as I had said, and those were the things that I had remembered. And of course, the biggest part I remembered was the ending the biggest part, the most memorable and main part that I had remembered was in the end, at least in the movie, I can't remember the story too well because it had to be either junior high or elementary school when we read the story. It was in like a book of stories. I guess back then they would allow something. I would seriously doubt you'd see this in any book now, but in either elementary school or junior high, they had a book of stories, and this was in it. And it goes way beyond what I've said. My memory, because it's been so long, and when I read it, it was a long time ago, and I only read it once, and I only saw the movie once. But he gets on TV and blows his brains out to show everybody. Like I think he tells everyone what's going on. You essentially have this underground oligarchy that runs the government. You have a president who is, at least this is in the movie, the president who is elected by lottery, who actually is funny, is played by the father from American Pie. He's been in so many fucking movies. I can't think of his name right now. Eugene Levy plays the president. And it's funny. I guess it was quoted by attorneys in a brief before the Kansas Supreme Court. So I've heard that Kurt Vonnegut was lean towards anarchism, actually. Maybe not, or no government, but he had been someone who supported freedom. Now, I don't know enough about him to know that. I know he was in Back to School. If you see the movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield, so he goes back to school. For people who haven't seen it, rent it or get it on DVR or whatever. Order it from Amazon. It's probably cheap. It came out in '86. But it's a funny-ass fucking movie. And Rodney Dangerfield is a rich millionaire who has this big business, and I don't even think he graduated from high school. And his son is going to college. But his son's like, I'm going to drop out, look at you and how successful you are. And he's like, well, I told you, without an education, you're nothing. Which I think has proven to be bullshit. Or maybe education is not the word. He said education, but you don't have to get an education from a university or from a government school. But I think education is important. It's just not schooling that's important. But he had said, I'll do it with you. So Rodney Dangerfield at like 60-something goes back to school. He doesn't have his high school transcripts or diploma. And it's funny because the fucking dean, and people that have seen it are probably laughing right now. People that haven't are probably like, what the fuck is this motherfucker talking about? But so the dean was Dean Martin, and everybody knows who Dean Martin is. Just, you know, even people that weren't alive, like I wasn't alive when Dean Martin was famous, but I know who Dean Martin is, a member of the Brat Pack or the Rat Pack. I'm thinking of the Brat Pack later in the 80s. But his last name was Martin, and you know they have the dean of the college, so they called him Dean Martin. And you know, he's like, how can I let somebody with no, it was the guy who got raped in Deliverance, actually, Ned Beatty. He's like, how can I let somebody with no real transcripts or, you know, no high school diploma into a prestigious school such as whatever the fuck the name of the school was. I think it was a made-up school. And he's like, and he said, we're known for we're handpicked. We handpick our students from the creme de la creme. And he's like, that's what I like about this school, Dean Martin. And so he donates money. And I'm going to totally forget my point. But now I remembered. So what Rodney Dangerfield does is in his English class, they have to do a paper on Kurt Vonnegut, right? So I didn't know Kurt Vonnegut was a lot like that young. I mean, I thought he was older for some reason. But I know he's dead now, but he was still alive in 1986. And I think he even died not that long ago. I'll have to look that up real quick. But yeah, Kurt Vonnegut was born he died in 2007. Yeah. So he died 9 years ago, April 11th, 2007 at 84. So yeah, he wasn't that old. Meaning, you know, he wasn't from like the generation before that. But like he didn't live in the 1800s. I had seen that movie so many times, and so he has to write a paper about Kurt Vonnegut, and he hires Kurt Vonnegut to write it. Not only does he hire him to write it, but the teacher, who's played by Sally Kellerman, who he's trying to date, he's like, you know, I know you didn't write this paper and whatever, and whoever did doesn't know a thing about Kurt Vonnegut. It's funny because Kurt Vonnegut wrote the fucking paper. I'm sorry, that was a long story to get to a, you know, semi-good punchline, but it's definitely a good movie. You should see it. But anyway, so I had heard that he was, you know, he leaned towards that. Now, I could be totally off because I think I had heard that from Anarchist, and this might have been later in his life, that he had these thoughts, and it might have just been, you know, something like that. We will look into it and say, okay, well, this must mean this, and that he
West Side. The world is mine, nigga, get back. Don't fuck with my stack. The gauge is whacked. About to drop the bomb, I'm the motherfucking dime.
Both teams get a grip on this operation, Heather. That's bored. Green light the asset.
Sir, I need more time.
We have no time. Are you going to give that order or not?
Sir, please.
You're too naive to see the truth. There's no bringing in Bourne.
We will defend these police officers.
Listen to police officers' commands, listen to what we tell you, and just stop. The nation needs to realize that when we tell you to do something, do it. And if you're wrong, you're wrong. If you're right, then the courts will figure it out.
We don't get to pick the law, we enforce it. But at the end of the day, each and every man should go home safe. Sometimes the use of force is necessary. You need to comply with the police officer the way the system was meant to be. Comply with the orders of police officers. Resisting arrest is a real and dangerous crime.
Nonpartisan Liberty for All. I'm your host, Dave Bourne, and it is October 11th, 2016, and we're coming to you live from Las Vegas, Nevada. Thank you for tuning in to Nonpartisan Liberty for All. We're on weeknights, Tuesday through Thursday at 7 o'clock Pacific, 10 o'clock Eastern on the Nonpartisan Liberty for All network, which now runs, actually, it's the Nonpartisan Liberty for All radio and media and radio network. I'm forgetting the name of my own network. Actually, I wrote it down wrong. So I'm going to fix that. Media and radio network, which now runs 24/7. And you can listen live on Spreaker.com and nonpartisanlibertyforall.com, and to the archives immediately following the show on Spreaker, YouTube, Twitter, Tumblr, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and iTunes. On Nonpartisan Liberty for All, we promote self-ownership and the ideas of true freedom and liberty, meaning being able to do whatever you want as long as you respect the freedom of others and don't interfere with their freedom. Exposing government for what it is, a mafia based on extortion that rules without consent by threat of force and violence. And they also rule with something they don't have: authority. They have no authority. And I might add this to my intro or redo my intro, but the thing that people forget about is that the government's authority is a bunch of men with guns, and that's it. You know, you may, somebody brought out a point, I think it was Ken Shorgen, who will be joining us tomorrow night. He joins us every other Wednesday to talk about geopolitics and the economy. But was that, well, some people essentially are ruled by money, or it wasn't ruled, it was more they comply. So they comply because they get a monthly check, or they comply because they feel an obligation or whatever. And that may be the case. However, at the same time, it's enforced by threat of force and violence. If you decide not to comply because of that, then the result is going to be violence. So even though a bunch of people may comply because they're brainwashed to, or because they get a check or food stamps from the government and they've been bought off, essentially, it doesn't mean that it's still not based on threat of force. Because bottom line is, it doesn't mean that every single person is complying because of threat of force. If they're not, I would say they're ignorant. And ignorance doesn't mean you're stupid. And I've explained this before. So if I use the word ignorant, look up the definition of ignorant. It's almost like it's similar to naive. It's, you just don't know the truth. You don't know what really goes on. So I would consider those people ignorant, not stupid. I said this before. You have obviously all of these scholars and supposedly geniuses that believe in the whole concept of